Everybody, we're just letting the room fill up before we get started. Okay, I think we can begin. Welcome everybody to tonight's event. My name is Christine Schmidt and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, our book chat with Menachem Kaiser, author of this really terrific book, Plunder, a Memoir of Family Property and Nazi Treasure. Thanks to all of you who've joined us on this new date, and our apologies for having to reschedule for a time when Menachem has since left London. Unfortunately, we were sort of bested by the tube strike and my illness, so apologies for that, but thank you for joining us on our new date. Tonight's event is part of the library's Family History Events series, which we've called Excavation, Confrontation, and Repair, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in a little bit. This program supports family research into the Holocaust more generally. We offer a dedicated service to support Holocaust survivors and their descendants and relatives of Holocaust victims and survivors in conducting research on their families' past. We use the International Tracing Service archive, which we have in copy at the library, as well as our other collections to support these kinds of research. And the people who come to us range from Holocaust survivors seeking documentation to support compensation and insurance claims, to those who have lived with only the outline of their family members' experiences, and still others seeking connections with living relatives and descendants in an attempt to repair the destruction of family ties by the Nazis, family ties by the Nazis and their allies during the Holocaust. So on that note, we are delighted to welcome Menachem Kaiser, whose book focuses on his own family story, or really about his experience of searching for his family story. This excellent book is revealing for many motivations, intentions, and outcomes for those who set out to examine their family's past, with often very painful, surprising, or unexpected findings. So I really urge everyone to pick up a copy if you haven't already. Here's my sort of dog-eared version. If you happen to be in London, we have quite a few in stock, which have been helpfully signed by Menachem when he dropped by a couple of days ago. So do stop in or contact us and we can send you a signed version. And I'll also put a link to the book in the chat shortly as well. So before I introduce him, just a few notes of housekeeping. We will chat for about the first 45 minutes or so, and then we'll be able to take up questions from the chat. So if you have any comments or questions at any time, please feel free to post them there and we'll pick them up. And you'll be kept on mute throughout the entire time, and your camera won't be appearing on screen. We are recording this session. We are also using the automated caption feature. Just to note that it is automated, so it doesn't always accurately reflect the words of the speaker. So now to introduce our guest. Menachem Kaiser holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan and was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and elsewhere, including a recent really interesting piece in Jewish Quarterly on YIVO. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and I assume that's where he's logging in now. So welcome, Menachem.
All right, Christine. Yeah, thank you so much for hosting me.
Thanks for joining us. I'm just pinning us so that everybody can see. Great. So if we can just start with just talking about how you began the journey to write this book, what motivated you to start your search. Essentially, tell us about your book.
Sure. It's funny, like, initially I was pretty uninterested in writing a book like this one. And so but the first time I went to Poland was actually right after the year I spent in Lithuania. I did a Fulbright there. I ended up studying mostly about the Vilna Ghetto. But I spent my time in Eastern Europe pretty uninterested in my own family history. It was something I grew up with, but it wasn't something that I would say I was very much motivated by or even all that curious about. So 3 of my 4 grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So it formed, a pretty significant part of my, let's say, familial Jewish identity. But there was no sort of there was nothing compelling there. I didn't know any details. I wasn't raised really to sort of seek it out. I wasn't motivated for any sort of roots trip or legacy trip. It just sort of was, to the extent it was a kind of a responsibility or a mechanism to induce guilt, that definitely existed. But there wasn't let's go explore this history. And so I actually went to Poland. It's kind of a long and funny story, but I ended up meeting this Hasidic guy in Vilnius, who is the road manager for the Scorpions, and who were in town on tour. And that was fun. I took them to karaoke, actually, where they refused to sing their own songs. And then this guy was this guy named Gluck, his father was the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is a region that doesn't really exist, but yet has a chief rabbi, and it's sort of based in Krakow. And so they invited me to come to Poland. So I kind of hopped over to Poland, again, really with no motivation to explore my own family. But then when I was there, I called my father. I was like, hey, Zadie, my grandfather was born somewhere close to Krakow. Do we have an address? And he gave me this address in a town called Sosnowiec. And I went, I saw the building. I was like, this is interesting, but I didn't really think I'd ever go back. And then finally in 2015, my father had for years at that point been bugging me. He's like, hey, we have all these pages. We have all these papers documenting something about ownership and reclamation. He's like, I don't really know what's in there, but you've been spending all this time in Poland. You've been meeting all these people. Maybe take a look. And so then he just faxed me those pages one summer when I was in Krakow. And really that's where the story begins. When I saw those pages, I had really, I would say for the first time in my life, kind of a sentimental encounter with my grandfather. He died before I was born. I never knew him. I didn't really have any conception of him. And so those pages revealed, I would say, a frustration. And frustration is interesting because it's a very human, it just feels very human. And I really felt like it was personifying my grandfather in a way that had never been accessible. And so and I was in the position, I spent a lot of time in Poland. I knew a lot of people. I was in graduate school. And so I had the summers off. And so I was sort of in a position to resume this mission. And I sort of began that mission as a way to sort of enter into conversation with my grandfather. And these were topics I was really interested in. I was really interested in the idea of restitution. So it was very, it was topical, but it wasn't necessarily, it was I was out to do something with personal meaning. Because again, I really did not know him. And at that point, I would say I was adamantly opposed to writing a book. I didn't think I could do it interesting. I didn't think I could do it honestly either. I think if I had tried to write it at that point, I would have sort of semi-consciously adopted a kind of sentimental narrative about my grandfather of oh, I'm getting closer to him and I'm sort of redeeming his memory in a way that wouldn't have really been true. But I didn't know how to write that book another way. And so the reclamation sort of begins actually before the book. But the book opens in 2015 when I begin the reclamation process.
Thanks. There is a sort of, it's not an important detail, but I find it interesting that you were getting faxes in 2015 or 16.
It was 70 pages. That's a fax. My father was not going to scan it. He just he still knows how to use the fax machine. So he just sort of faxed it to hotel, for anyone who's been in Krakow, Hotel Eden, which is sort of a Jewish hub. Where we're all friendly with the, with the receptionists and the staff. And so they just sort of received the fax from me. And then I, took it back to my Airbnb and went through it.
Yeah. And you talked about this, this journey to Poland, and you met such a variety of characters as you describe in the book, including the people who lived in the building you thought was your grandfather's, to those who hunt for treasure in the Owl Mountains. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the people you encountered, and I'm going to ask you a bit about the treasure hunters in particular, but maybe if you could sort of set the stage and talk about some of the different characters you've encountered in your search.
Yeah. And so I roughly divide the book into two different strands. And so like one strand being the reclamation process. And that is sort of my legal and to some extent moral journey into this, the reclamation, and also like the very idea of reclamation is like I'm reclaiming a building, but sort of more broadly trying to examine, interrogate my own motivations, like what it is I'm trying to do here. And so in the course of that, I knock on doors, I meet the residents. I have some like pretty powerful and unexpected encounters with the people who actually live in the building. I develop relationships with my lawyer, the killer, her daughter / paralegal, Grzina. And some city officials, some stuff actually didn't make it in the book. Like I did meet some like city officials, some politicians, other people who've been involved in reclamation, both successful and ongoing, and actually failed. And so that's sort of one strand of the book. The other strand is the treasure hunter, in which it's a little bit of a longer story, but I basically became a celebrity among Silesian treasure hunters on account of a secret diary that was written by a relative I did not know I had. That's the very condensed elevator pitch. Yeah, and that is a very colorful cast of characters. So that's meaning these quote unquote treasure hunters they're hard to describe to like sort of American or British audiences. For American audiences, the way I describe it, I would say it's like spelunkers mixed with conspiracy theorists mixed with Civil War reenactors. But like they see themselves as, I would call it, extremely hands-on historians / amateur archaeologists. And so like it's sometimes a joke, it's sometimes not a joke. Some of them are doing very trivial things. Some of them are actually finding real treasure. Some of them are doing very legitimate research. The example I cite in the book is like one of them actually spent quite a few years tracking down a forgotten concentration camp, like one that is just not on the map. And so he just found it. He took me out to this field outside Świdnica, and there was like like a row of bricks where the barracks had been. And so some of them are doing really legitimate research. So that is a very big cast of characters. There's a few sort of, I would say, main ones who are my entry, who are sort of like my protagonist treasure hunters. They tend to be like older, mostly male, in their 50s and 60s, very macho. They live in smaller villages usually, not always. Some of them live in bigger cities. They wear a lot of camouflage. They tend to have a lot of like fancy digging toys, for lack of a better word, and some of them drink pretty hard. So yeah, it's a wide cast of characters.
It sounds like sort of at the beginning, you described that you sort of had you felt this kind of kinship for the treasure hunters in a way. But by the end, when you describe this scene, when you go sort of camping with them and you really get enmeshed in this encounter, it seems like your feelings became a bit more complicated, and but ultimately you understood them and you were sympathetic to what they were trying to do. So I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about this kinship that you felt and the kind of relationship of different kinds of searches that are going on in this book, because you mentioned that there's this kind of culture around their searching, and I wonder if you could comment on whether you think there's a similar culture around Holocaust family research or searching.
It's really interesting. I think there's like a kind of a parallel, but parallel, like not the same. As in, yeah. And so, my case, and like for many people I know who do sort of, I would call like Holocaust family explorations, let's say, you are dealing in it's pretty abstract. And so you're trying to figure out who, like what was going on, where maybe what the story is, you want to fill in the gaps. most people I know who've done research, family research in Eastern Europe, don't know the actual place. Like that, it's sort of pretty abstract to them. The treasure hunters, in a way that was like pretty hard to relate to for quite a while, are very grounded. Like they're very much particular sites, like in places, like what this place was, like what is, like literally what is this structure, what is this thing, what was the purpose. um and so that to me was like a pretty striking. Like the more I got to know them, the more I was like their approach and attitude to wartime history is going to be pretty different, just because it's like kind of literally their backyard. And so, they see them as like first and foremost sites. And like for us, or for the way I was raised, we see them as events. And like what's the sort of our primary lens, which we're looking at. As like most people I know who know their history backwards and forwards couldn't trace it on a map. They know the story and they know the people involved, but geography is sort of absent. And so I found that to be really interesting. And then, in my case, I was suddenly dealing with a very particular and local building, like very tangible. I was trying to get a very specific address back. And so I found like this, so there was sort of interesting overlap. And yeah, I found like sort of, I would call it more thematic echoes of sort of like them, what are they searching for, and sort of the questions that are behind these searches. Sometimes they're asking them, sometimes they're not asking them. Some of them are actually very, very introspective, and some of them are not. But to me, that became the more pressing and interesting question of like not necessarily the quote unquote treasure, but sort of the process of trying to figure out the meaning of it. And so to me, the treasure hunters were a really interesting counter, like a contra narrative to what I was doing, because of like, they're dealing with very tangible items, but they never actually find it. And they're also sort of dabbling in myth. And I was like, my own story started getting sort of more and more soaked in myth. I kept making mistakes. I made errors. You're just sort of, how do you disentangle like what is actually true from sort of like the narratives we're just bringing along with us? And so, yeah, they were, the truth. And so when I answered your first question, when I was like, I'm never going to write this book. What changed my mind actually was sort of becoming, getting involved with the treasure hunters and becoming known in that community. And at that point, it actually felt like I had much more room. Like I could sort of resist that sentimental narrative, because I had a frame with which to explore these questions of searching and finding and like quote unquote treasure. That wasn't one that was simply of like, I'm connecting with my grandfather. It just felt much more honest, because I was able to avoid sort of like pretty reductive sentimental arcs. So yeah, that's like a little bit of a mess of an answer, but the treasure hunters were just like, there's just a lot. They're a lot to deal with. And so like when you're writing into them, you really have to figure out where you stand.
Yes, and I think that grappling with where you stood and where you stand actually comes through really well. And I'm going to come back to this question of myth in a couple minutes, but just picking up on what you were saying about this ambiguity you felt towards sentimentalization, which I think you described pretty early on. And I think actually one of the most moving aspects of your book is when you talk about the kind of non-material forms of inheritance, and the loss of minhag with the destruction of Jewish life during the Holocaust. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I've like picked up your quote on page 132 of the book, where you talk about this, this familiar form of non-material inheritance and what makes an object. It's the cherishing. It's not the object itself. It's the cherishing that's passed down. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this and the kind of the role of religion and kind of familial or spiritual or private spirituality in your search.
Yeah, so I come from an Orthodox family, and so the attitude towards like what inheritance is an interesting one. And so like within my family, the most important thing that could be passed down is practice and observance and tradition done properly. And so I have a confrontation that I record in the book with my father at a certain point. I was home in Toronto, and like I ended up getting offended by something, and I like, as many of us do, I think, when we're with our parents, we revert. When we're upset, we kind of revert to our teenage selves. And I remember, it was on Shabbos, it was at the meal, and like everyone then said, they said like the Birkat Hamazon, the prayer after the meals. And I was like being a teenager, and I was like sulking, and I like very clearly was refusing to engage. And afterwards, my father, it ignited a conflict. And so my father, he asked me, he was like, why are you so interested in this building? Like, what are you doing with this building? And to me, I was like, I'm doing this thing, I'm reclaiming a building, it feels like part of the legacy. And my father was like, great, but at the end of the day, it's not what your grandfather would have cared about. And it took me a while to sort of appreciate what he meant on his own terms. But to me, he was saying something, he was sort of expanding the idea of inheritance. And so I was sort of coming along and defining this notion of inheritance as something very narrow, to just like this building that was be passed down. My father was like, and my father, who is sort of the rightful representative of my grandfather, he was like, that's not the primary mode. Like, that's not the thing that you're supposed to care about. And it really sort of led me look at it really differently. This, like, what is this idea of non-material inheritance? And it doesn't inherit. We have such a like material connotation of the word. But in my family, like, that's what gets passed down. And so like, that's how things get remembered. That's how things get cherished. Like we really, really care about yichus, which it roughly translates to lineage of like who we come from. We have no heirlooms. I cannot think of like a single heirloom that my parents have that they received from their parents, or let alone their grandparents. And it's just like, no one really cared. We weren't really taught to care about sort of like what's, I don't know, some tchotchke or like some watch or whatever it is. But we're taught very much to care about these things like this, like Jewish law and Jewish practice. And so that, I didn't agree with my father in the end, but I was able to sort of appreciate what he was telling me, and sort of the implied critique of sort of being very myopic about what my relationship with my grandfather is like. And it was hard. It was like sort of the most emotionally challenging part of being there, and also of writing. Like, so how do you sort of like define your relationship to this grandparent who might have disapproved of your lifestyle in a lot of ways, and when basically the entire the motivation you're sort of proclaiming is like, I'm doing this in the name of my grandfather, and if he were around, he might disavow that. That's a hard thing to hold. And so, but I really appreciated it. I appreciated sort of that sort of dimension coming into play, because that wasn't obvious to me coming in. And I wouldn't have thought about that had my father not sort of really pressed me on it.
Yeah, it's clear that tension sort of pushed the kind of sort of reckoning with that along. And sort of on that theme, what has your family said about your book now? I mean, since the reception. I mean, I know that there's the story about your mom stopping into the chat on sort of one of your early chats, really, but fun. In terms of your the reception of your book, has the meaning of your search changed since you published it? How has your family reacted to the reception?
It's an interesting question. I think like there was I showed them, the thing I was most nervous about was there was a chapter about a legal fight that happened in my family, like when I was a kid. I was most nervous about that one, and I actually showed them that chapter before the book. And they asked me to make some really minor changes that had a big effect of sort of anonymizing and also sort of making it more parv, basically. And so that I changed. And otherwise, and the reaction, it was unexpected, I would say. Like, sort of the immediate reaction was an unexpected one. The stuff that sort of implied, I was very nervous about sort of these even very implicit but somewhat public proclamations of my non-observance, like even if it was there. And so I was very nervous how they would react to it. They ended up being really good about it. They felt sort of heartbroken in a really interesting way about the chapter where I get drunk with the treasure hunters. And that's not something I would have anticipated, but it makes, I get it. I get it. They felt like very protective of me, and they felt like I was sort of damaging. They felt it was like damaging material in a way that was really misguided. Again, I disagree. I'm okay with that, but I totally get it as like a parental like protectiveness. And then outside of that, they've been really supportive. And I think it's also, it's the story was a very confusing one to them until the book existed, because basically for 5 years I'm like going to Poland and coming back and being like, oh, new relative and treasure hunters. I would just sort of like spew this sort of real zany information at them. And like everyone was kind of bemused and confused by my like periodic updates. And so what the book also is, like in a very private way, like within my family, it is sort of like an organized way of talking about this. And so like they got it. It's very hard to understand what I was doing without the book, because it's like too long, it's too spread out, it's too confusing. And so that is, in a way, is like a real gift. And the fact that it got some amount of traction, and like that people read it and responded to it, I think has been very gratifying to them. I think they, one, I think they're proud, and two, I think it's like their family story has sort of taken on like a little bit of a public dimension, and something that's like people are looking at. And overall, I think they've been really, proud and surprised. And so it's overall been like a real wonderful, that part's been a little wonderful journey. And then I had a really, really fun fight with my aunt about, there was a draft that in the early draft of the book, I mentioned something about my grandmother having a cover on her couch. And my aunt got so angry. She said Bubby never had a plastic cover on the couch, and it's defamation to suggest that she did. And then I actually took it out because we had an insane argument with both of us bringing evidence to like support our claims. It became this big like family one argument, really fun. But for her, the stakes were really high. But I'm hoping within the next few days to have an essay about that whole fight. So that was like a fun one. But overall, been sort of really really nice. It was like just a real very smooth and nice and fun.
That's great. I'll be looking forward to seeing that next essay. So just a question about the genre, and we talked a little bit about this the other day when we met, just a bit. So I just was struck when I was reading your book, and I think a lot of people might have this similar impression. And this is kind of something you confirmed at one point when you said you sort of didn't trust the genre that you were writing in, that this memoir is in many ways pretty different from other kind of Holocaust-related family memoirs, perhaps particularly because there's like no real resolution at the end necessarily, but also the tone is different. There's, it's obviously very funny in some parts. There's some irony there, and there's anger, which is also interesting to read, sort of frustration, and also kind of maybe an implied criticism of the genre, or at least the place of your search within it. So I just wonder how the process of writing a memoir versus a novel or some other literary form, which I know that you've sort of talked about doing as well, shaped your views of family history writing and the genre more generally.
Yeah, it is a genre I am, to put it diplomatic, very cautious, like very wary of. Not because I don't think it's important, just because like I really don't relate to them very often, like because I didn't have that sort of relationship with my grandparents, and I didn't have that relationship with the Holocaust. Like it wasn't a source of trauma growing up. And like these books, like to have written the book in sort of that voice, like so that is sort of like dominant in the genre, would have felt to me really dishonest. And sort of like I didn't feel like I had a personal demon that I was like grappling with, that I didn't feel traumatized by the Holocaust, and I didn't know my grandparents, and like I knew some of them, but like I certainly didn't know my grandfather. And I never really, it's just part of like how these books, they sometimes come together kind of accidentally. Like the whole thing with the treasure hunters happened. I was like, ugh. I was annoyed in a way, because I was like, now the book is too weird to, now my story is too weird to at least not try to write a book. And so I was like, I have to try and so I didn't write a book at that point. I wrote a book proposal. And so basically, for those who are unaware, what happens is you write a book proposal, which is basically an essay about you and about the book you plan to write. And it includes maybe 1 or 2 sample chapters, but for really all intents and purposes, you have not written the book. And then you sell the book proposal. And then, if you're lucky, hopefully, you get the book sells. But at that point, you're really locked in. And sort of you promise a book, and like, people don't ever write about this kind of stuff, and it's never going to be visible in the book. But like that's where sort of the market ends up influencing the book. And so you really want to sort of maximize the sellability of the book proposal. And so you look around, you're saying, what is the market rewarded in the past? And so like you are somewhat like promising or pitching a book that sort of works. And then they say yes. And then that's kind of what they expect. And so like, to the extent you could subvert that, it's interesting, but you can't really do a bait and switch. It's funny when the book went out to the publishers, and like a couple publishers were really interested, and all of them asked the same question. They were like, okay, are you going to get the building back? And I was like, of course I'm going to get the building back. And I wasn't being disingenuous. At that point, I really thought I was. And I told them that's how the book is going to end. The book will have this really neat and cathartic ending. I'm going to get the building back, and it's going to be amazing. And I'm going to go with my father, and we're going to go to the Polish court, and it'll be so moving and touching. And then a year passes, and I'm like, oh shit! Like there's no way I'm getting this building back. And I had to like break the news to my publisher, and I was terrified. I didn't know what would happen. I was like, maybe they would think it was no project. So in a way, like the project subverted itself, which was really nice, because it actually forced me to write a kind of a different book, definitely a very, very different ending. And but yeah, like I did have this resistance to the genre, and like the only way I could write it and not hate the book and myself was to try and be honest about it. And so that's sort of when I start undermining myself and try to an extent undermining my story and sort of the genre, that's just me being like, there's no grand design, but it's being like, this is the only way I know how to do this honestly, which is basically to qualify it. And so and that's what kind of did. Like, but I didn't come in with any sort of big, like large critical motivations. I wasn't out to sort of make a statement. I was just trying to write a book that I didn't hate.
Which is, I think, a good goal, actually, to start with. So kind of coming back to this issue or this theme that you raised about sort of myth and narrative, and I'm interested in this, obviously, as a historian, kind of about how historical narrative is constructed. And I think there's a common thread in your book about how you parse kind of multiple narratives to achieve this sense of the whole. As you said, this is the first time your family's seen this story now, after you've shared all these zany stories as they were coming out, as you were doing this research. So I just want to think about, how you sort of relate myth and history to each other in the book, especially when you follow Abraham Kaiser's path. And maybe you can say a little bit more about that book in a second. But it struck me that you were, and I think this is what you were saying now, that you were really honest about this process, kind of deconstructing the process of constructing this narrative. And I think, although you come at this from a different perspective than a historian, this is what I think historians do all the time, but they're probably just less transparent about it in many ways. So I just wondered if you could first tell us a bit about Abraham Kaiser's story, this remarkable book that's been published in multiple places. And in your view, what is the place of family histories of the Holocaust or searching for this information in broader understanding of these events? I mean, you're coming at it from a different perspective from a historian, and the historians don't have the market on telling this story. So I just wonder how you position this kind of telling.
Yeah, so yeah, broadly, I mean, kind of quickly, the Abraham, he was a slave laborer in Project Riza, which is this series of tunnels or underground complexes that the Nazis built for sort of secret, potentially nefarious reasons. But he was a slave laborer in sort of the camps that supplied workers. So he was in 8 of them. And then basically the story of the diary and how it got written is like a pretty remarkable one in its own right, even putting aside the contents. So basically he would write on these stolen scraps of cement packaging. And right before he'd be transferred from camp to camp, he'd take them and nail them to the underside of the latrine. And then he ended up surviving the war. In his memoir, he writes that he sort of escapes and he meets this German woman who isn't named and persuades her to hide him in the basement in like a box meant for storing potatoes. And then he's there, it's like a paragraph later, and like he's there for a month. Then this Russian soldier opens it up and is like, hey, you're free. And that's the end of the memoir. But the story continues, and we know the story because there's a preface written by the Polish editor. He borrows a bicycle from this German woman, rides from camp to camp, collecting the scraps, brings it to the aforementioned Polish editor, and they turn it into a book, and it gets published in Poland in 1962. And because like this, the work site, Project Riza, has basically no primary documentation, this book has become like a major source text for the treasure hunters, like somewhat of like a mythological text. And Abraham is like a mythological figure, and that's and he's related to me, and like that's how I became a celebrity in the community. So that's the story of the memoir. So what was the second half of the question?
So yeah, sorry, that was a long-winded one. Get to the next one. So essentially, just how do you see this sort of form of narrative, this kind of search for information? What are the place of family histories in understanding the Holocaust?
Right. It's interesting because like we treat them very sacredly and like rightfully, but it's interesting like to bring in an interesting tension when we talk like from a historical perspective and like a family narrative perspective. And most people who like care deeply and have researched deeply their own family stories are not professional historians, and they're not approaching it like that. And great, and I don't think there's anything, I think it's good. But like the element of myth is going to be present in even our most personal stories. Like I can't, it happened to me literally dozens of instances, and a lot of them are in the book where like I push on a detail and I find out it's wrong, whether it's a typo or the wrong building or the story that being a child at home is incorrect. It's just wrong. And I like hanging out in Poland over the last
couch cover, for example.
The couch cover. And like hanging out in Poland over the last decade and like being sort of running point on a lot of people's like little personal stories of them coming. It's like a very high rate of people who come to Poland or other Eastern European countries. They think they know the story. They look into it. They have it wrong on some level, minor or major detail. And so like, you don't therefore discard the story. That's not the point, or like find errors in a survivor's testimony or things like that. But like the sort of the element of myth is there, and it just feels important to like acknowledge. And so like myth and history are never going to be easily disentangled. And so like when we sort of expand and go from like to sort of a different notion of truth, like to me like a higher order of truth is that it carries history and it carries story, and it's meant to do something, and it's meant to like hold memory and testimony. And also like, yeah, if someone's fabricating something, I think it's very bad. But you just have to be prepared. And I think it's much more interesting when like the mythical elements get acknowledged. And so it makes our job as storytellers I think much richer. Like when we sort of we're dealing with like what is the raw material we're dealing with. It's not pure history because there isn't really any such thing as pure history.
Thanks for that. I see that there's a question coming in now from the chat, which I'm going to turn to in a second. And just to remind everyone, please feel free to post your questions in, and I will pick them up in a second. So I'm kind of coming towards the end of my questions, but I just wondered if you could talk a bit about your next projects. It sounds like you have the couch cover one is coming soon. I just wonder, are you thinking of publishing Abraham Kaiser's book in English?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am. So I've been talking with some presses to, hopefully, I'm hoping within the next year, because I already have the translation ready. Like I had it privately commissioned. And I've been really sort of like happily surprised by how many people are interested in reading it. And like that's been sort of my dream all along, to have that book available alongside my own. That feels like very interesting and special. So yeah, I'm in talks with, it's taken a lot longer than I had hoped, but I'm in, there's some different presses who are interested in publishing it.
And other projects? Other ones in the works?
Yeah, there's, sort of a very slow moving film project, not about my book exactly, but about the Polish Golden Train, which I think is a story that has not been told fully yet. And then everything else is still very early. And so, but that's sort of the biggest sort of offshoot of this project is going to be that documentary film, hopefully.
Great. And finally, can you just say, what stage is the court case on the building today? Can you say, or is it?
Sure. But obviously what happened is like literally the day I submitted my final draft, like quite literally that day, the courts got back to me and they were like, okay, you have the death certificates. And so like the major hurdle was cleared. Last Passover, so just under a year ago, there was another trial where my father gave testimony. Mm-hmm. And then they basically did this like kind of screwy thing of like they gave us like a technical victory, but it was also sort of made it like it was a partial victory, so we had to appeal it, and so that's going through. And then the last major update was the city actually intervened. The mayor seems to have personally intervened in the case to try and get the building back to the city, which I from what I understand, I actually think it's a real positive development, because it means we're definitely on the radar. And it means like they're sort of, it just seems like a Hail Mary, like unless they do something extra legal in order to seize the building, it's like, it would be completely bewildering what rights they have to assume ownership. But so it does, it feels close, but it's felt close for quite some time. So like, I'm not holding my breath, but
so it's still ongoing then.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm going to ask that question that I'm not sure you can answer about the eggs. Were there eggs? Are you going to reveal whether there are eggs soon? You have to read the book to understand what I'm referring to.
You have to read the book. I do tell people that they just have to email me, because I have like a brief request, and then I'm happy to do it. But like I have a fun little request for those who have read the book, or for those who will, and I hope many of you will, be in touch.
So that is another plug to buy the book and read it, because then you'll know what we're talking about, but I don't want to reveal what that is. So so I'm just going to turn now to some questions in the chat. So there's a question about the translation into Dutch, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the Dutch, but why is it the air, Misha is asking, instead of plunder?
Oh, there's a funny story, actually. So the initially, I don't know if whoever asked the question speaks Dutch. But I understand the Nalatenschap means the legacy, but maybe it means different things. But basically, initially, it got translated very like a linear. It was like a pretty, it was like a straightforward translation, which translated to roof, R-O-O-F. And so which means, I guess, means plunder or something along those lines. And so the first design, like this, they submitted the cover design. I loved it. From all the editions all over the world, it was by far my favorite design. It was really beautiful. It was just like, and I had sort of an illustration of a building, and it said ROOF, but there was like a kind of lukewarm response by the booksellers, and in the Netherlands, the booksellers have like a surprising amount of say, and so basically there was confusion because it looked like it was about a roof. People were like, everyone speaks English, it's about a building, it's going to get associated with roof, and so they switched it to something like more sepia. So they changed it to like the legacy. It could be legacy or the air, I guess, or air makes sense too. So they changed it to like kind of more Holocausty, and they put like a photo, kind of a Holocausty photo on the cover, and I was like, okay, you guys know your country. I don't know that. I was like,
Misha's actually showing it. You can see it. And
oh, there, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they gave me a bunch of options, and I was like, that's sort of the one I hated the least. But I was also like, look, I don't know the market. I'm not going to pretend. I like really, really into that roof cover. I thought it was really beautiful, but that's kind of it. That's what happened. That's an interesting thing of like the market dictating both title and image.
Yes, and it's interesting to think about how it dictated, how it potentially shaped how you wrote the book, as it was going on, since, as you said, it wasn't finished yet while you were doing this.
That is like a research thing that I don't think anyone has done yet, of like looking at like book covers about Holocaust stuff and like what imagery, and like you see the titles, like there's like an ongoing joke with some other writers who've like written within the space of like the blank of Auschwitz. And like you just how many books there, the tattooist, the wife, the cousins, the brothers, the sisters, there's like literally endless things. And so yeah, the thing is like what worked in the past is going to get pushed in the future. And so it's a fun little research topic if anyone wants it.
Anybody can pick it up. It's a good one. So there's another question about sources. Dan's asking, can you say what sources, if any, you found on the Riza camps? And he's mentioned that there are some in the ITS archive.
The camps or the project or the construction or the tunnels?
Let's see if he replies. Both.
Oh, okay. There is like very, very little on both, to be honest, from what I know. The main sort of, for sure about the camps, the main sources we have are the memoirs, and primarily is Menachem Kaiser's memoirs considered the primary source on many of those camps. There's another one written by a guy named Henrik Sussman. So he has there's some sources from his memoir. We don't have great German documentation as far as I know. Like if you look in the Holocaust Memorial Museum Encyclopedia, it's primarily from those memoirs. And in terms of the like Riza, the construct, like the tunnels, the underground complexes, it's like very, very little. There's really quite like a shocking absence. We have some secondary stuff, like Albert Speer mentions it in his endnotes in his memoirs that he wrote after the war. So it's like something clearly on the radar of the German brass. But and there's like some here and there, there's some like weird satellite imagery, or not satellite, like I guess planes, like over aerial shots, but really very, very little. And so this is part of the reason why Menachem Kaiser's memoir is as important as it is, not just to the treasure hunters, but to anyone who does research about Riza. You basically start with Menachem Kaiser's memoir. And there's a museum, the Museum of Gross Rosen, which is part the Riza sites are part of the Gross Rosen concentration camp network. That would be, if that's the main place to go. And so they have some really outstanding researchers who've either worked with them or are on staff, and they've written some stuff which is like as far as I know, the only scholarly stuff on Riza.
Thanks. Let me see if there's any other questions. Okay, one's just come in. Sorry, my Zoom is doing something strange. really, Sandra's saying she really enjoyed the book and its irreverence. Have you noticed differences in the responses to your book in different countries? And is there going to be, or is there already a German edition?
Oh, there will be a German edition. I think it's early next year. I haven't gotten confirmation, but there definitely will be a German edition. Have I noticed a response in different countries? Yeah, it's funny because like I don't know if the response will be different, but the people I meet will be different. So like by and large, the people I've sort of talked to in the US have been Jewish. Like those are the people who are going to show up to events. When I went to Amsterdam it was not like I was not like sort of talking to Jews. That was people are more careful. People are like more scared about the topic. There's like there's in the US people have been less scared, about the topic. The wild card here is Poland. And so the book is coming out in Poland, I think in the fall. But I would say the most interesting and charged responses I've gotten are from Polish nationalists, sorry. And so a few sort of expat Polish nationalists have really disliked the book and have critiqued it, mostly online or on Twitter. And I found their stuff really interesting, to be honest. They really don't like it, but I found their criticisms to be like so misguided. Like I think there is an interesting critique to be written from a Polish perspective. Like, and I hope that happens actually. But I found some of these responses to be like so bizarre that they were kind of entertaining. Like Christine, I think I mentioned to you before I saw that someone accused me of what they called selective Judeo-centric moralization. And I was like, that is just like a wild, it's like a wild thing to accuse like a Jewish kid, writing his memoir about his grandfather of selective Judeo-centric moralization. But I'm into it. I mean, like that, that's fun. So, but that's it. Yeah. And then I am really interested in if, once it comes out in Germany and once it comes out in Poland, especially. In Poland, it has there's politics. Like a book like this is like, you can't really talk about this without getting political. So I'm really interested in that. And then that's kind of it. I can't think of any other disparities.
Thanks. Okay, a couple more coming in. Elizabeth is saying that while reading the book, she thought about the work of the historian Tia Miles, who has written about haunted spaces, dark tourism, and race and slavery in the context of US history, and says there's an obvious connection here to Holocaust tourism and the treasure hunters. But more generally, I'd be interested in hearing whether you felt that these places you visited were haunted by the past and what that meant for you as you wrote the book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that historian, but I'm very interested in looking the work up. I use haunted as like I think it's a really good metaphor for some of these sites, and it's just like you can't escape it. Like I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, but I believe like there is whatever you want to call it. Maybe it's like an implicit, like an inherent energy, or it has an effect on the people who visit. And you sort of have to grapple with an invisible past. And so absolutely, I'm all in on that metaphor. I think it's a really good one. And I think it's one like, it's a good starting point for how to sort of deal with it, or even like think how to deal with it. And it's just like, you learn about this stuff growing up, and then you go to the country and it's like it's carpeted. It is carpeted in sites of massacre. And so for me, like these questions are often sort of initially intellectual questions and then secondarily emotional questions. That's just kind of how I'm built. And you're like, well, I find those questions really challenging. So you're like, well, if like, in Krakow, you have the giant park that was a killing field. And so you're like, okay, how do you think about it? Like, how do you think in terms of memory? How do you think of like in terms of usage? It very quickly becomes, again, about politics and sort of like who owns the narrative, who decides the narrative. You have questions of memorials. What should they look like? Who should they speak to? But yeah, to me, these are all going to be in the frame of a hauntedness. And so yes, I'm all in on the metaphor.
Elizabeth asked a follow-up question about the eggs, that she led a discussion of the book in a book club, and the participants were very angry that they didn't get an answer about the golden eggs.
Tell them to email me. I have like a quick request and then I give the answer.
Good. And so there's another question from Stephen. Who owns the apartments and or the building now? He's saying that he did research on the restitution of Jewish-owned property in Hungary in the 1990s and came to the conclusion that restitution to the heirs of the former owners might lead to injustice to the current owners who may have acquired the properties in good faith and may have suffered in the war or under communism. But perhaps his views were influenced by the fact that his own Jewish Hungarian family owned and therefore lost nothing of value.
Right. So the property, unlike most restitution claims, my claim is not one of it's not technically restitution. It's not one like the property wasn't nationalized or sold to anyone else. Like there isn't like another owner on the other side that I'm sort of wrestling with. That said, I don't know exactly what's going on because the city won't give me any documentation until I've established ownership. And so I don't exactly know. The fact that the city has now intervened is pretty indicative that it is what we thought it was, which is basically the city, no one owns the building. My family owns the building, but like we have to update the registry. So like right now it is an ownerless building, which is like a technical term in Poland. And then the city manages it, maybe a subsidized rent, we don't know. And that would be pretty good news all around because the city would then be responsible to compensate the current inhabitants. And so, but yeah, I don't entirely know sort of the legal status of it, but and then someone popped up at one of my events who like had some expertise, and he was like, you don't even realize like someone could own an individual apartment within a building that you own. And I was like, I don't know. All I know is that I'm sure there's more for me to be surprised by. Like I've not gotten to the bottom of this, but all in all, again, the city has not shared documentation, has done what they could to sort of stymie my efforts. But again, no one owns that property. That's clear.
It sounds like there's going to be a sequel, potentially.
I'm not writing another book about this, but
maybe not a book-length sequel, a short essay.
Maybe an update. Yeah, right. I was kind of hoping to that something would happen and I could include it in the paperback. You know, in the US, it came out in hardcover and it came out actually today in paperback. But that, I would have had to have written that 6 months ago. So right. Yeah, so maybe if all of a sudden there's a rush and I go into another printing, but again, unlikely.
Hopefully. Okay, I'm just checking to make sure that I've grabbed everybody's questions. It looks like I have. So I think with that, we've covered a lot of really interesting ground, particularly about sort of this journey and this, as you refer to it, I think at the beginning, this kind of memory safari in a way, and how your views on this have changed. It was a very refreshing kind of deconstruction of this search process, and I really recommend everyone has a read of your book, buys it, because it's really, really interesting, very compelling reading, and just wanted to thank you for taking the time to chat with us and to chat with me and for the library. And I'm sorry that we couldn't do this in person, but hopefully the next time you're in London, maybe on your next film project, we could do it.
Thank you so much. And I'm including, if anyone wants to be in touch, if they want to yell at me about the eggs or whatever it is, I included an email address that could be reached at. And so to make it easy for everyone. And again, yeah, I so appreciate the invite. And I so appreciate it to everyone who, I guess, logged in.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody who's attended. And please do check our website. We'll be having more events in this series coming up. And we will, of course, put all of that information on our website. Our next event in our online event series has to do with Jewish experience and history in Ukraine and applying historical knowledge to what is happening today. So please do check out our website if you haven't done so, and do sign up for our events. So thanks again, Menachem, and thanks to all for logging in.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.